Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Pietro Omodeo. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation. Pietro is an historian of science and philosophy and works with historical epistemology. He specializes mainly in the early modern period in his research, and he's currently leading an ERC project on cosmology in the 17th century. And perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to see you again because we have been seeing each other in different circumstances, and it is a pleasure to talking to you again.
Yeah, we have an occasion to update and continue our conversation.
Yes. Please let us know a little bit more about your research and your research projects.
Yes, gladly. So thank you again. So I work basically on the history of cosmology. This is one of my main research topics, and the group in Venice works on many aspects of early modern discourses on the cosmos, on the order of nature, on the stars. And I was glad to be invited to this talk, to this conversation, to see how astrology enters this picture. And of course, early modern science includes astrology as an important component. I have to confess that myself, having worked a lot on astronomy, I encountered astrology many times, but I still feel I haven't the depth to understand many aspects of it. Still, I'd like to share with you some research that might be of interest to you and to those who follow you.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so one of the things that you have been studying is, and I'm very curious about this, Cartesian astrology.
Yes, so I would take this occasion to speak about my research on Cartesianism, in particular on German Cartesianism. It's a research strand that I started a few years ago when I was in Germany, working on other topics, and that led me to the Berlin and Potsdam archives, so archives related to the history of Brandenburg and Prussia. And as it is often the case in archives, I encountered materials that were unexpected to me and became one important strand of research for me. It's materials on a German Cartesian, actually a Polish emigre of Bohemian origins, who studied in the Netherlands and became acquainted with Cartesian philosophy in the 17th century. And I think it's a very interesting case because apart from embracing, or as part of his embracing the new mechanic philosophy of Descartes, which he defended and disseminated in the German territories, he was also a keen supporter of astrology. And the mixing of these two elements is quite curious to me. It was at least unexpected. We know now of other cases, but when I first encountered it, it was sort of surprise.
Yeah. Yes. I've heard the other case I've heard was with Gadrois, Claude Gadrois, who wrote small papers on.
Yes, Gadrois was this French Cartesian who wrote a discourse on starry influences accorded to Cartesian philosophy. It was the 70s of the 17th century. My, so to say, my hero, or my the person I've been studying, whose name is Johannes Placentinus, actually Kowalczyk, Latinized as Placentinus. He defended Cartesian astrology a bit earlier, and it might be of interest to you that it was emerges more from his practice than from a specific tract dedicated to Cartesian astrology. In other words, I have some publications of his that and some letters that defend this connection of Cartesian natural philosophy, the mechanic understanding of nature according to Descartes' principles of nature, and astrological practice. And so if I can, I'd like to share a few images with you. So this is the sort of cover slide of the images I'd like to discuss with you. So it's about the mechanization of astrology. That's how I called it. Since it's a reframing of astrology by this person, Johannes Placentinus, a reframing or a new foundation. That's his idea. New foundation on, as I said, on Cartesian principles. And so here it is the sort of so here you can see one of his texts that I suppose looks familiar to historians of astrology. It's an observation of a comet and an occultation of Aldebaran. So that's the topic. And these two events are described mathematically by Placentinus, and they include horoscopes and also attempts to make parallels with other historical moments. So there is a sort of astrological analysis of the phenomena, and accompanied with cases in history that are considered to be relevant for a complete assessment. So you have here on the bottom, perhaps you can see that there is the new foundation of Rome, 572 before Christ. And the other one is Byzantium, the fall of Byzantium.
Oh, okay. And on the top is the comet.
Exactly, you see.
Oh,
so here you have Eclipsis Aldebaran, 1664. You see here, and here the comet Primum Visus. So the
seen for the first time.
First sighting, yeah.
First sighting, yes.
First sight, and that's when the horoscope is cast. I wanted to start with this image because it leads us immediately to an astrological context. And at the same time, as I said, the astrological theme is clear. The practice is there. The mathematical knowledge too, as you can see from observations and so on. What is particular is the cultural context of this. So here you are, the publication.
Terrible, commented terribly.
Look at that. This is the terrible comet. And the eclipse of the royal star, Aldebaran. So it has a lot of resonances with political topics. If you look carefully, or not so that carefully, actually, it emerges immediately. It's a text that is bilingual, Latin and German. It's Latin, especially for the technical parts. So mathematics is in Latin. Whereas the interpretation, the description, so all that is discursive is in both languages, Latin and German. So it also points to different readerships.
That is interesting. Yes, the Latin technical parts for specialists, and then the other one in common language, in this case, German, for everybody.
Yeah, that's good, because I've just finished studying a manuscript for my PhD, in which he when he comes to the judgment, he shifts from Portuguese to Latin.
Oh, that's a different
thing. So he
thing.
gives the judgment in Latin exactly for the opposite reason. So it is not accessible to those who are unable to understand what he means.
That is a different, different intent.
Different strategy. Yeah.
I suppose from other cases that the technical part is not that inaccessible to somebody who doesn't know Latin, because it's numbers, basically, and geometry. I say that because I was struck many years ago when I encountered the Ursus translation of Copernicus in German. The Ursus translation of Copernicus in German, it was a translation only of the text, whereas all tables were left in Latin. since the reader could not, so the German-speaking reader without knowledge of Latin could read the numbers but could not read the text, and that was. I think it might be a similar case. I don't think there is. I don't think there is any reason for censorship here, because we are in German territories where astrology is well established. It is not problematic from a religious viewpoint, unlike other contexts. So, and that might even explain in part the existence of these Cartesian astrologists without big issues, especially exactly in this context where astrology was well established and not really censored as in other settings.
Yeah, like the Catholic area, yes.
Or even, I mean, Catholic Calvinist criticism. So I suppose that the context helped him to continue pursuing this particular project. This is another text of his that I would also like to show you. It's also in German. It's about winds, so sort of tempest that happened, and you also have the astrological chart on the right. On the left, you have the frontispiece. It's interesting that it is a physical astrological report, Bericht. It's a report. It's physical and astrological in the sense, as one gets reading the text, that there is the astrological, mathematical astrological part, which is important for the interpretation, as well as the physical, which is the explanation. So the physical explanation is as I can anticipate, is a Cartesian one. So it's based on efficient causes, matter, motions, and their laws according to the cart. Whereas the astrology is so in a way, the Cartesian physics is the new background for astrology, giving a different physical explanation of astrological processes.
Would you say that this physical Cartesian background, as you call it, replaced the Aristotelian basis?
Yes, I think that's the project. So the project is to have a new physics that is accorded to astrology, more or less traditional. I say more or less traditional because there are also changes in astrology due to the new physics. At least I could detect one, but a significant one, I think. But in general terms, it's about having a scientific, as Placentinus claimed, scientific astrology, scientific in the sense that it's observational and based on causal explanations, which are sounds with nature, according to him. This could not be achieved through Aristotelianism. It had to be achieved through the new Cartesian philosophy. The story is a bit more complex, actually, but if you have questions.
Well, I do. I do. But aren't there any kind of points in common between the older base and now this new? Because some things are, I would say, observational. It's something that you just observe. And is it completely different, or do they have something in common?
So my impression, now speaking of Cartesians in general, I have the impression that many of them don't reject, so to say, facts. Facts meaning well-established connections, or what they assume to be well-established connections that have been traded, but they need to explain that differently. So in other words, in many cases, it's not all cases, but in several cases, it's not only in astrology, for instance, in medicine, or even in certain contexts, like let's call it for convenience, psychosomatic medicine. I found Cartesians after Placentinus, but also in Germany, who were Protestants, so they didn't accept saints, they didn't accept miracles to relics and so on, but they accepted the fact that some people get cured through relics and by praying saints as the Catholics do. So for Protestants, this was a form of superstition, and they claim that it's superstition. On the other hand, they saw the fact, and they found explanations to explain. Yeah. So they didn't deny the fact; they gave a different explanation. Yeah.
I remember Descartes wrote also the I don't know how to say it in English, but something like the Treatise on the Passions of the Soul. So it's also something that it's kind of difficult to fit into, but maybe could help with this kind of cures through prayer or miracles. So because he does give this mechanical explanation for all the states of mind and sadness and all sorts of things like tears. I remember this.
Yeah.
And I read this when I was very young, and I thought it was extremely funny.
Yeah. No, actually, that's something that that cultural historians have to keep in mind, that the intentions or even the work of the author leads to various reception lines. And the text you mentioned, La Passion de l'âme, is really one of the texts that was widely received and discussed in these days as something that allowed precisely to make the connection between mental states, passions, and physical conditions. In a way that doesn't fit the the alleged dichotomy of the mental and the bodily in Cartesian philosophy. So it could lead to that, but it's not always the case. In medicine, it's certainly not the case. Psychosomatic medicine in many ways was relied on Cartesianism, on that connection that sometimes is considered not to be part of the Cartesian philosophy. And here you are, a text. This is a sort of pamphlet-like university defense of Descartes. It's called Descartes Triumphans. If you see that, it's a bit small here. Descartes Triumphans. Okay. That's you see on the top. Yeah, Descartes Triumphans. Principia Philosophiae Cartesianae. It's university disputations defended by Placentinus' pupils while he was professor of mathematics at the University of Frankfurt on Oder in Brandenburg, appointed in the early 50s. And there he started to fight to establish Cartesianism and Cartesian ideas, especially natural philosophical ones, against Aristotelian critics who relied on the Melanchthonian tradition and regarded this new physics, this new philosophy as infringing against the statutes of the university and its tradition. So there is a sort of complex story of a Cartesian fight against more Melanchthonian scholastic scholars. And this is to show you the two faces, or at least two of the faces of Placentinus: his defense in a university setting of Descartes, and his astrological work, the one I just showed you. And
let me ask you something. When this one was to defend Cartesianism against, so to say, Aristotelianism, and how does, I don't know if this question makes much sense, but Aristotelianism was already confronted, so to say, with these Neoplatonic movements that were already in the move, so to say, before Cartesianism. How does this third element, Neoplatonism, fit or confront with Cartesianism, or do they just ignore it?
So that's an important element in Placentinus' work. I will point to that. Okay. But that's an interesting question, and it relates very much to different contexts. So in the late 16th century, there is this revival of Platonic. It started earlier, but it culminated in the 16th century in Italy. This Platonic legacy, very widespread and reinterpreted by scholars who were incredibly original, like Patrizzi, or even Bruno or Campanella, those sort of philosophers who took many ideas from Neoplatonic philosophy and clashed with the Aristotelian tradition. Of course, there is a lot of Ficinian legacy in all that. So that leads us 1 century earlier. In Germany, especially in these Protestant universities I have in sight, I think the Melanchthonian tradition is much stronger. The Melanchthonian tradition, to me, implies sort of methodological Aristotelianism, not too literal, or at least a bit distant from scholastic developments. So it relates much more directly on the Aristotelian corpus, and doesn't really accept all those scholastic strands that were part of what was considered the medieval tradition. Neoplatonism is less present there, so ideas like the anima mundi and so are less strongly widespread, apart from cases of reception. So, for instance, Jean Fernel is very present, and with Jean Fernel we have Platonic ideas entering medicine, received by scholars like Sennert in Wittenberg. So that there is a sort of subcutaneous Platonic tradition there. But in the case of Sennert, for instance, it's well merged with the Aristotelian context. Okay. With Placentinus, it's a different thing. He was rather compared, and his ideas, actually Cartesian ideas, were rather compared with Ramism. Since Ramism was a sort of anti-Aristotelian approach to culture and science, so it already encountered cases of struggles and censorship in German territories. Melanchthon, for instance, was completely against Ramism, and many followers, Aristotelian methodological followers in the German university were against. And Ramism also came from it had the flavor of some Calvinist connection, because of course Ramos was himself a Calvinist. Mm-hmm. So the card coming from the Netherlands, from the German viewpoint, could also be considered to be connected in some way with Calvinist settings. So there are these sort of strange cultural reception lines, and on the top of it, the anti-Aristotelianism. Yes. It was problematic, and Placentinus in the end adopted this strategy, the strategy that you can see from the cover of this disputation that I'm showing here. Mm-hmm. This is a disputation that Placentinus defended in 1656 after he received the support of the electoral prince of Brandenburg, who was the chief or the political authority that also ruled over the University of Frankfurt on the Oder. And Placentinus received from the prince the right to freely teach Cartesianism. And that's the moment in which he presented a sort of list of theses that argued for the harmonization or the concordance between Aristotle and Descartes.
Concordance.
But you see, it's called syncretismus, syncretismus philosophicus. Yeah. I think there are more sincere cases, perhaps, than this one. Because there is a lot of literature on scholastic Cartesianism and forms of interaction between Cartesianism and scholasticism. In this case, I really have the impression that it's a sort of provocation. It says, okay, I have the power now, or the right to defend Descartes, and I'll show you that even Descartes' skepticism can be accorded to so the cogito ergo sum or the methodological doubt that all finds some reference in the Aristotelian corpus. So it's rather Aristotle read as a Cartesian rather than the other way around.
Yes. So he was already in a safe place, so to say, academically. He decided to write this. Okay.
And he also became the mathematician of the electoral prince of Brandenburg.
Which is a good situation.
Which is a very good situation, and it's not irrelevant, perhaps, to his astrological practice. I don't have evidence of horoscopes cast for the prince or for the court. Actually, they were Calvinists. So, again, I'm not sure what the situation was. So it was a strange situation in which you have the ruler Calvinist and the subjects Lutherans. And in between, people like Placentinus, professor of mathematics, inspired by Cartesian philosophy, but probably neither Calvinist nor Lutheran nor Catholic, but rather either a Bohemian brother, probably a Bohemian brother, because that's his family origin.
Okay. So quite a mixture.
And he exchanged also with Socinians. Since he came from Poland, Poland was the land of Socinianism in those days. That's also interesting for the astrology issue, because Socinians rejected astrology. So also other Polish people who corresponded with Placentinus at some point discussed his astrological convictions, which Placentinus defended. And it's also clear that the Socinian context was a context of, let's say, with a word that is very much used, of marginalization of astrology. It's really explicit in some exchanges between Placentinus on the one hand and his country fellow Lubianiecki, who was the author of a huge book of data about comets in the late 60s of the 17th century. We have more, mathematical technical works like this Geotomia. That's a book on the measurement of longitude and other similar problems of cosmography, which Placentinus dedicated to his protector, Elizabeth of Bohemia, who is the dedicatee, if not the inspirer of Descartes' Les Passions de l'âme. She was a patron of philosophers, a correspondent of thinkers, religious radicals, and she was a relative of the Prince of Brandenburg, Friedrich Wilhelm of Brandenburg. She was also the protector of Placentinus. This is a nice picture of her as a young lady. So this is Placentinus' last writing, the last one I could find. It's in the let me remember, it's in the, I think it's in the Secret State Archive of Prussia in Berlin, and that's a technical mathematical text written to Elizabeth of Pfalz, so the Cartesian protector, or the dedicatee of important works by Descartes. This text is interesting because it was written in 1666 after, just to tell you a bit of the biography. I will tell you more about the biography of Placentinus, but that's the last writing after 66, when he was declared mentally mad, included and taken away from all posts and even from civil life in many ways. So Placentinus' career ended with a sort of tragedy. He lived on several years, but 1666 is the end of his scientific activity and teaching activity, at least as far as I can tell. But there is still this text, which is a technical mathematical one, again on longitude issues, so on issues that were very important in those days. And in my view, it's also a sign he wanted to give to the external world while he was recluded as a mentally mad person, that he was still capable of reasoning. And he is writing to Elizabeth of Pfalz as his protector, perhaps able to intercede for him or mediate and have him freed. So this is the geography of Placentinus' life and career. He was born in Poland, Leszno, Lissa in Latin. That's the town of Comenius, actually, where Comenius headed to and establish his famous school. I suppose that Placentinus, as a Bohemian himself, at least of origins, attended that gymnasium. So that's where he started his education. Then from Leszno, he moved to the important gymnasium of Gdańsk, where he studied mathematics and astronomy with Eichstätt, a famous mathematician in those days. a bit earlier than Hevelius as an important figure in the local settings. Then he studied in Königsberg, still in Prussia, then went to the Netherlands, where he studied in Groningen and in Leiden. And that's where he became a fervent Cartesian. He moved back to Germany. After a brief stay in Heidelberg, he became professor in Frankfurt on Oder. This is the world he lived in.
Yeah.
The dates: 1629 is his birthday, 1683 his date of when he died, and here are the different places and stops in his wandering career. I mean, it's not only a medieval thing, but in the early modernity, scholars, clerks, and students traveled a lot. This is a sort of Northern European pattern, though, connecting basically Protestant centers. Say basically Protestant because there is a lot of flexibility also on confessional issues. This is something that was published in 1683 at his death, claiming that that's verses. I took just the last part of of a poem dedicated to him, celebrating Placentinus, saying Johannem Placentinum, it's the accusative, there is something coming before that, Philosophum Astronomum Mathematicum. He has all these qualities, not astrologer, but astronomer can comprise it. In Philosopho Aristotelem, that's funny. He's praised as an Aristotelian. In Astronomo Copernicum, okay, that's correct. He was a defender of Copernican astronomy. In Mathematico Archimedem, which again sounds rather rhetoric than real. He was not really dealing with mechanics, but he was or with other aspects of mathematics, but rather with physics, new physics, the principles of nature, and astronomy plus astrology and connected disciplines.
In uno omnes.
In uno omnes, so it was a good synthesis. He was an interesting person. He's not the major thinker of his time, but still a very interesting figure, and probably he influenced many students of his who could attend his classes. And here we come to another text. I'm showing you many pictures today. This is a Dissertatio Philosophica. So it comes also from a university context. It's a Dissertatio Philosophica on, let's say, on the stellar origin of life. We are entering an almost astrological realm. I say almost astrological because it's not necessarily astrological, but it already prepares us to understand the setting of Placentinus astrology. It is about the origin, the germination of the seed, the development of life, and the way life is sustained through the stellar action. The idea comes from an author that I already mentioned, from Fernel, this Platonic medicine, the idea that there is a distant action of the stars, a sort of heat that lets the seed germinate and produce living beings. It is an idea that we find also in Sennert, and here it's Cartesianized, so it's mechanized too. Placentinus assumes that the origin of life is the stellar heat, just as Fernel would have it, but the stellar heat is explained as the ethereal element of Cartesian physics.
Okay.
One more case of a transformation of doctrine.
They adapt the ideas. Yeah, very interesting.
This dissertation raised a lot of polemics because it cast into doubt one crucial assumption of Aristotelianism, or Aristotelian, let's say between us, biology. The idea that life is originated by the individual soul, and the individual soul is the life of the organic body. For Placentinus, the soul, as a Cartesian, is just mental. It's the mental realm of the cogitationes. So life cannot be explained through the mental. That's what he assumes. And not through the soul, because the soul is only human. It is not shared by other living beings. So what remains? It remains the heating mechanism of a Cartesian-like mechanic body, in which it's the stellar heat that starts the process and keeps it running. It is of Neoplatonic origin, but as you see, it becomes a different thing. It becomes a Cartesian doctrine, which was very much disputed. Placentinus became the target of attacks from the University of Wittenberg. So he was in Frankfurt, Brandenburg. Wittenberg, Saxony is the place of his critics, among whom the most important is Georg Kaspar Kirchmeier. You see a small portrait of it. And they published between Frankfurt and Saxony a lot of texts, disputations and counter-disputations to discuss the soul, the origin of life, Cartesian principles, Aristotelian principles. What resulted was a sort of incompatibility between the two conceptions, at least of the soul and of life. As you see, it's the years 1659, 1660. I'm not going to discuss all these publications. I went through them. I think the gist of the topic is there are polemics going on about the action of the stars, not necessarily astrological, but as I said, with close connection to astrological issues. You have also this sort of publications of the life of man, Vita Hominis. These are by a certain Samuel Henschel, who also came from Lissa and was a professor of philosophy in Wittenberg. Coming from the same town as Placentinus, different university, engaged in a list of disputations against his the professor of mathematics of Frankfurt. You see, it's very explicit. The criticism is this one is a disputationem anti-Placentinianam, for instance. So the target is clear, the enmity is there. And this is the last text by Placentinus of this controversy over the stellar origin of life. It's a philosophical dissertation, a dissertatio philosophica, as well as the earlier ones, on Cartesian method here. And the Cartesian method is about explaining how scientific certainty can be achieved through the card. What I'd like to point here is not the Cartesian epistemology issue, but rather the dedicatees. Again, we are in a court setting, not anymore in the Brandenburg one. The dedicatees, and the most important one is Raimondo Montecuccoli, who was the most important general of the imperial army in the war with Sweden. So it's days of war with Sweden. Northern Europe is in turmoil due to the different armies running through the country. Placentinus gets in contact with important Kiliarchoi, as he calls them, generals, commanders of the imperial army, and he dedicates to them this text, which is a sort of less word of the controversy. I'd like to point to that as an early modern tactic, at least very much employed by Placentinus, to end academic disputations through the protection of some powerful authority. When he had troubles with his colleagues in Frankfurt, it was enough to have the protection of the local prince. But in the case of two universities having issues with each other under different jurisdictions, I suppose it was important to get a higher support, and the higher support in this case is from the imperial court instead of the Brandenburg or Saxony one.
Yeah. Friends in high places.
Yeah, you see, I think it's this is also a very complex intellectual biography. You have these high located patrons, disputations on various scientific, natural, astronomical, cosmological topics, and also all sorts of means to carry on the controversy, from university disputations to letters to patrons, to the reclusion and exclusion of a person like Placentinus as a mentally sick person at the very end of the whole polemic. So we can say he lost in the end, but by very unexpected means, at least. And so this is one case that I really wish to show you the stellar origin of life, because even if it's not astrology, strictly speaking, it's about distant action of the stars. And this is another case, also a relevant one, is physics and astrology applied to winds, comets, and novae.
Mm-hmm.
Placentinus discusses comets, novae, and winds, and explains them, as I said, through mechanic principles. And the mechanic principles are derived basically from Descartes' tidal theory. It's a mechanic one. Descartes doesn't deny the action of the moon, but he thinks it's a sort of, the moon exerts a pressure on the particles of matter, and this pressure gets transmitted to the waters of the earth, and the waters of the earth are moved according to the regularities of the sea tides. So the doctrine that was traditionally astrological, I mean, if you think of Albumazar and the importance that sea tides had for defenses of astrology throughout the centuries, here we have the paradoxical case of a mechanization of tides that might be used as an anti-astrological argument. There is no distant action, it's particles in motion, reused by Placentinus as the sound physical explanation for distant actions, including astrological ones. So this is another German text in which he discusses sea tides according to Cartesian philosophy, and on the basis of these principles, he comes to his physical and astrological report on the tempest that I showed you at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, a German-speaking publication, accompanied also by discussions with famous scholars of the day, like Hevelius in Gdańsk. There are some letters that are preserved in the archives of an exchange with Hevelius. That was very precious for Placentinus, because Hevelius observed the nova that he himself, Placentinus, could not observe. And according to Placentinus' interpretation, the nova that escaped his sight but was observed by Hevelius was the ultimate origin and cause of the winds that he was explaining also through his astrological charts. The idea is sort of mechanic one. Once a star disappears and becomes becomes a nova and then disappears, the disappearance of the star creates a huge motion of particles in the cosmos that gets transmitted to the earth and has consequences like winds.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. It's a mechanical account for connections that were given in different contexts.
Yeah.
One could really investigate astrological reports. This is one of them, and seeing how the connection was made by other authors between starry phenomena and what is called astrometeorology, for instance. Hevelius himself was not happy to be published. The letter I showed you was published by, or the correspondence was partially published by Placentinus in his astrological text on the winds. Hevelius was not happy about that. Hevelius himself was no supporter of astrology and was part of a network of astronomers and natural philosophers who were skeptical about that. Hevelius was really unhappy of seeing his letter published without asking in a book by Placentinus, seeking again for authoritative voices to bring forward his ideas. See, this is the Tempest horoscope of the Tempest of 16 November 1660, accompanied by Hevelius' observation of the nova and the physical explanation of it. And here you are my third case of astrological uses by Placentinus, the political use of astrology. So Placentinus is was convinced that that the correct interpretation of those phenomena should have a civil and political meaning too. It's not uncommon in the astrological tradition. In Placentinus' case, he called for tolerant politics in years of furious religious wars. So he thought that the occultation of Aldebaran and the comet that of 64-65 that he discussed in the text I showed you should be seen as an admonishment to the rulers of Europe to practice a new form of politics, very much a tolerant one. So you have this element that is part of Placentinus' commitment to political issues, also for personal reasons. We can imagine he was involved from his own family. And also it's part of his interpretation of the astrology. He wrote on this with Lubieniecki. Here you have a portrait of Lubieniecki. This person was a Polish aristocrat, a Socinian that flew from Poland in the years of the Swedish War. Since the Socinians were suspected of supporting the Swedes, they were then banned from Poland, and Lubieniecki sought refuge in Hamburg and in Denmark. In these days, he started to collect reports and informations about the comet of 64-65, and among the correspondents, there was also his correspondence. There was also Placentinus, whose letters are included in the Theatrum Cometicum of 1668. In these letters, Placentinus and Lubieniecki discuss the legitimacy of astrology. Placentinus defines it. Lubieniecki expresses his doubts, even though in a moderate manner, so respectful of his addressee, but pointing to the fact that many of the correspondents of his network would not be ready to support Placentinus' astrology. It's not the problem of Descartes plus astrology. It started being a problem of astrology itself. And I conclude with this image, the last one I'd like to show you. It points to the eschatological dimension of Placentinus' analysis. Placentinus uses Descartes to argue that novae, stars, planets, and the sun are basically homogeneous bodies in the universe. Stars can be transformed into comets, and comets can be transformed into planets.
Wow, that's much like pneuma. The Stoics had this idea, everything was made of the same substance. The only difference was the concentration of the pneuma of the substance. Is it the same idea?
In fact, the idea of the fluidity of the heavens bears a strong Stoic legacy in the 16th century. Here we have the cosmological principle of homogeneity that is very much part of the Cartesian cosmology. Before Descartes, we have Giordano Bruno as a defender of cosmological homogeneity, and the fluidity, of course, it's very much connected with cometary discourses. Yeah. In Descartes, you have this particular theory that the sunspots, the one observed through the telescope by Galileo and others, are signs of the possible darkening of the sun. And here you have the case in which the sun or a star becomes completely darkened. And the moment in which a star is completely darkened, it's a nova. So the nova is a darkened star in which the spots, the starry spots or the solar spots have covered the whole disk. At that point, the star starts to move and abandons its own system and traverses the other systems. And through this motion, it becomes visible to other spectators in the world in the form of a comet. In some cases, these comets can become planets, so be co-opted in another system as planets, additional planets. And this is relevant for two reasons that I would like to stress. One is we can connect the card here with the eschatological considerations. The sunspots are signs of the end of the world, particularly strong winds that are interpreted astrologically, since they are connected with phenomena like the birth or the end of a star and the birth, so to say, of a nova, or the birth of a new comet. They are harbingers of bad news, including the end of the solar system, that is the end of our world. Mm-hmm. And I think this is this is a very interesting element to add to the political dimension, because it gives one additional. The other consequence is a consequence for astrology that Placentinus discussed briefly in some of his letters. That is, if comets are planets, should we include them in the horoscopes? Okay. And it says yes. So that's his answer. So he at least theoretizes a reform of astrology, including new insights coming from Cartesian philosophy. Yeah. This one is a very interesting one, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. Yes, and the way they interpret things that are already known, but not in this context. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's one of the questions as I have always in my mind with comets is exactly when they shift a sublunary phenomenon to a celestial phenomenon, then it acquires a different nature. So how does that integrate into astrology? And we know that at this time we have immense quantity of details on comets and interpretation of comets. So what is the consequence of it being recognized as a celestial body and not as a sublunary phenomenon? And that's something it's never really discussed fully, at least by any author that I know of. And it's interesting that he's making the point here through, of course, a Cartesian lens, but still he's making the point. This is a different reality. So if it's a celestial body, it has a different stature than the equivalent to the planet in this case.
I completely agree. I think the more general question is when there are shifts in theories about the cosmos, of course, but of nature or even specific aspects of nature, how does it affect well-established disciplines or theories? Can they be adapted? Are they rejected? Are they transformed? A typical similar case to me is the case of heliocentric theory. So when the heliocentric theory gets introduced, how does it affect astrology? In what form? A new celestial order, is it a problem or is it not a problem for a discipline like astrology or connected disciplines like medicine and so on? I think this is a question that more or less was at least raised and addressed by many scholars. It still remains a puzzling one. The question about what happens to astrology with the homogenization of the cosmos is an additional one. I agree. It's also very, very interesting one.
Yeah.
Another interesting. Well, first of all, thank you for this. This is extremely interesting and shows not only the technical part, mathematical or astrological, but shows mainly the interconnection between political context and religious context and scientific context and everything interacting together. This is very, very interesting. My question is, this is already 17th century and then 18th century. So it's when astrology is declining, so to say. I wouldn't say it died because it's still there, but it entered into a coma or something like that. And one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons, and we discussed this a lot between us, of this decline is the fall, so to say, of the Aristotelian system. And this is my question. This provides an alternative. And it was very much into the mood, into the zeitgeist of that time, because it's kind of really like it fits perfectly. But it didn't actually, apart from a few people like this, Placentinus and Gadrois and other people, but it did not replace, in astrology, it didn't replace the Aristotelian decaying system, because by then it was decaying. And this would be, for me, it would be the perfect candidate to, I don't really, personally, it's not my taste, but I understand that it would be
one of the good candidates
a very good candidate
to replace
but it
as
didn't.
an explanatory system for astrology.
Was it?
Yeah, I agree. You know, on the other hand, also the connection between Aristotelianism and astrology is also a historical product. So the merging of the two elements is not necessary. On the one hand, we have in the early modernity many cases of anti-Aristotelian, anti-astrological minded Aristotelians.
Yes.
There are also very interesting cases in Northern Europe. There is a group of Aristotelians very critical of astrology, gathered around that humanist in Wrocław, in Breslau, Judith Bardellati. And they corresponded with Tycho. And Tycho had a lot of troubles convincing them to accept his world conception. And at some point, he conceded to them that they didn't need to support astrology to support his planetary system, which shows that these Aristotelians were making the opposite connection. No, we as Aristotelians are not going to endorse. But you're right. As a cultural system, that's really what we have. And Placentinus is certainly doing the attempt to establish or to construct an astrology, perhaps even revise it in some form, based on a rational and empirical science. I say rational and empirical because it's exactly what he claims. When Lubianetsky says, we're not going to support you on this, or probably you will receive a lot of criticism, he says, why? That's rational and empirical, how a sound science should be, and find it very interesting. So on the other hand, if we are going to address the problem of the decline of astrology, I think that there are really multiple factors, and altogether, probably that's why I also point to the social settings, the religious ones. I think that all plays a role in the unfolding of the historic drama, if you like. We have religious elements. I think they are, for a long time, even more important than the strictly philosophical and natural philosophical, let's say, scientific ones.
Yes, it's very complex. It's not just one, but one of the main criticisms would be, of course, the licitude of astrology being licit. Can it be practiced according to religious principles? But the other one would be also, does it work?
Does it work? Science?
And of course, there are other elements also. Even the popularization of astrology, it made it very simple, and a lot. It's really a very complex situation. That's why I began my question by talking about all this intricacy between political and astrological and religious and all these elements together. But anyway, this would be, for me, if I was living in the 17th century and wanted to defend astrology, I could probably have a look at least at this idea, just because it provides another system apart from Aristotelianism. But anyway, astrology doesn't need Aristotelianism to work, because you can see in other civilizations, like in India, we don't have this.
There is another interesting case to me, also late 16th, early 17th century, Campanella's astrology. That was quite influential for a while. That was a sort of Neoplatonic Telesian natural philosophy supporting his astrology. He was also very critical of Aristotelianism, both in natural philosophy and in theology. Still a convinced Catholic, and is a keen supporter of astrology on the basis of very different natural principles. So that would be also sort of candidate for an alternative natural philosophy of astrology.
Well, 17th century, I would probably go for Campanella.
Yeah, no, he is an amazing figure, really. The other question, the decline, or connected to that, does it work? I think it's also the point of how the certain discipline and practice is ingrained in a cultural system or in a scientific system more strictly. I suspect that one of the realms in which astrology was fundamental and could not be renounced, even after the condemnation by Calvin or by the Catholic Church, is medicine. So the history of medicine, in my view, is also very important to reconstruct the history of astrology and its decline. So until astrology is part of medicine, it's, I would say, in the cultural system, cannot be renounced, because how can you marginalize medicine? So the other question to me, the question that I'm really fascinated about, is not very much the marginalization, but the legacy. That's what I'm much more interested in, the history of science. That is, I was once asked, so what was astrology's contribution to the modern scientific world? So like, sort of scientist, but straightforward question. And then I thought, okay, let me find pieces of science in today's world that come from that context. And I think there are several, sometimes not acknowledged. An important one to me, just to mention for the sake of discussion, an important one is for me sea tidal theories. The legacy is clear and direct. Another one is Newtonian physics. So if the passage from astrological conceptions, the Gilbertian Keplerian world physics, and to the Newtonian, it's a process. Its roots are in astrological debates. That's clear. I'm not claiming that Newton's science is, but he was very much suspected by his contemporaries, because it revived certain ideas that were considered to be by necessity part of the astrological world conception.
And perhaps also meteorology and the understanding of atmospheric phenomenon. It has, until the early 18th century, a lot of connections with astrology.
And something else that has not been studied it's been pointed out, not really studied, is the legacy of astrological thought in the social sciences, in particular in economy, but not only in economy. Think of, of course, it's complex intellectual structures. The idea that astrology, that's a typical Melanchthonian idea. Astrology is the science of the stars. The stars are ruled by God and his providence. Therefore, astrology is the science of God's providence. Mm-hmm. We can read through the stars the unfolding of human history, or important aspects of the unfolding of human history. And so we have this close connection between stars and human history. And that's something I would say that even after astrology, remains a very important idea. Think of Adam Smith's Invisible Hand, or the key terms of economic thought, from crisis to the conjuncture, and that's really, it comes from there. It's been pointed out, not really studied. I would be very curious to see how these words were received and adopted and transformed into disciplines that are on our daily news, actually.
Yeah, because people think when they look at astrology from the exterior, they think, astrology is just calculating a few horoscopes for babies or something. But it isn't. It's like, it's so much ingrained into the culture. The mentality of astrology is very important. The other thing that question has, like, what has astrology done for us? Because that's the question. If we try to fit astrology into our 21st century frame of mind, it's not fair, not for us, not for astrology as a cultural phenomena, because it has to be understood in its own context, which is extremely complex, multicultural, and it's very, very complex. But what is implied, I think, and tell me if I'm reading too much in it, is that either astrology has something to give us in our mentality, it fits into our mind frame, otherwise it's not valid. Well, it's the same to say, you could say the same about poetry or music or other phenomena. It's just a cultural phenomena. It's not just a practice. It's not just people calculating horoscopes. It's so much more. It's a mentality. So if it doesn't fit the 21st century mind frame, or if it cannot be reproduced in a laboratory, because it can't and it shouldn't be. So if this makes it somehow useless or not,
I completely agree.
yeah,
I was sort of dissecting astrology, in the last in my last considerations, just to to pinpoint certain. But in general, I completely agree with you. It's in general, history of science and history of culture, or of cultural forms, of cultural expressions, from literature to religion to philosophy and the sciences, is a problem or an issue, to me at least, of how they are integrated in a cultural whole, also including its material dimension, not only the mental. And of course, it's about what functions certain ideas have, certain sets of ideas, certain disciplines, how they are related to the others. And apart from the functions, which is a bit mechanistic, also the actions they have. Why people embrace certain ideas, what do they do with these ideas, what they expect, what they do in reality, and so on. I fully agree. It's not about, of course, there is always, I don't even dare saying the risk of anachronism. We tend to search in history answers for what is of concern to us. So a certain degree of distortion is what makes history healthy, because it makes it relevant to us.
I was also thinking, going a little bit back, it's also, I think, astrology in terms of science is also provided a motivation, a background motivation to develop certain skills and certain understandings of nature, because there is this need either to improve technical outputs, to understand better how certain conjunctions and how certain configurations will occur, and it has that interpretative drive that somehow impels knowledge to progress and to move, even if then it diverts from its original purpose. But I think it also has that important function to motivate and to serve as a...
Yeah, no, I sure, I agree. There is this, let me say, if I can, more psychological dimension or motivational one, but it's also about practice in the stricter sense, not just the psychological motivation, but also what you do with the technique, with certain knowledge. The context of practices that imply astrology, I think, are very important, as well as in many other sciences. Science, the pure science per se, is a sort of very abstract thing, but actually science is always part of a society and the culture. So I think it's very legitimate to ask questions on how science serves our societies or served our societies in the past. And then I agree with you. We can see the psychological dimension, the motivational one, and I would say also the very practical one. So what did, to stay with our example, a physician do in the 16th century with astrology? For what purposes? To cure what diseases, with what outcomes? And that's really what makes our understanding of past science alive to me. And it tells a lot about our science of today.
Yes, and our interests today, because we ask what we are interested in, about what we are interested in. Well, it is a very interesting phenomenon.
Okay.
Okay, so very much for this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was very interesting. It's always nice to see these
Other
less known perspectives.
Yeah.
And I think this moment in history is quite critical, where they're rethinking and trying to find alternative explanations to a lot of phenomena, and astrology being one of them. And it's interesting to have this perspective.
And your presentation raised a lot of questions, not only technical, of course, also, but in general, this context, all the interaction between all these elements in the context of astrology is very, very interesting. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you for the nice conversation, and I'm looking forward to looking at the other interviews, more interviews, and to continue the conversation.
Oh yes,
of course.
We will reschedule very soon. Thank you.
Ciao.